This is a question that crops up quite a few times and is an important question. Was the flood global or local? Well, I'm just going to put up some key points. One is that God told us that in the latter days, scoffers would arise who would doubt that there was a flood. So that is indeed quite an important thing for us because we believe we're in the latter days and we would expect that people would scoff at the idea of a flood. But the scripture emphasises that it was a global flood, and it goes out of the way to show it couldn't be a local one by the points that it makes, which we'll look at in a moment. And God has promised that he never again would flood the earth, and there have been many floods. So if it was a local flood, then God has broken his word, and we know that God doesn't lie. So my simple answer is yes, it was a global flood. So let's look at 2 Peter. I'll put all the references up there, but 2 Peter chapter 3, talking about the latter days. And we know, in fairness, when Peter was talking about the latter days, he immediately was thinking about the events of AD 70. But there is an echo about the things that he said that apply down to our age. And this is what he said. Know this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. And he says what they forget about, that things haven't continued the same from the beginning of creation, was a little matter about God's judgment in the flood. And so in verse 6 he says, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So he was saying there will be people in the latter days who wouldn't believe that there was this perishing of the world by a flood. Now, Jesus believed in a universal flood. We just take that last verse of Matthew 24 and verse 39, that they went into the ark, he believed they went into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So Jesus believed that in the time of the flood, only those in the ark survived. All the rest were taken away. And the interesting thing is that when God describes the flood, whether it's in the New Testament or the Old Testament, he uses a special word for the flood. There are different words for local floods, and that's not the word that is used. Can somebody tell me how you pronounce that Hebrew word?
Mabul.
Sorry? Mabul. Oh, that's how I'm going to pronounce it, but it means a deluge. And normally it's the Mabul, the deluge. And that distinguishes it from other words that are used, because there are floods described, local floods that are described elsewhere in the scripture, but that's a different word. When we come to the New Testament, and Jesus talks about the flood, or Peter about the flood, then it's the cataclysmos, from which we get a cataclysm. So it's something outside the normal course of events. So that's another indication. But when we read the accounts, and I've just put up the appropriate verses from Genesis chapter 7 and verses 19 to 23, you can see the great emphasis that is made upon everything. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. All the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. All flesh died. Fowl, cattle, beast, every creeping thing, every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land died. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the earth, both man, cattle, creeping things, fowl of the heaven, they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So there's great emphasis, especially in the Hebrew, double emphases in many parts there, which indicate that it must have been a universal flood, because you can't have waters 15 cubits above the mountains unless the whole earth is covered, when you can have water 15 cubits above the mountains. And as a writer remarks, what more could you add to that account to make it a universal flood? It's gone out of its way to describe it as being universal. Now, there is the counterside to that it goes out of its way to show it wasn't a local thing, because there would be absolutely no point in Noah building an ark if it was a local flood. He could just command them to go over the mountains and escape. But it spent 120 years, we believe, building this ark because an ark was needed. And he built a vessel that was big enough to hold all the animals. Whereas if it was a local flood, then there would be lots of animals that didn't need to be taken onto the ark. And there's emphasis, they had to take on board the birds. Well, the birds could just simply fly a few miles and escape, but they had to be taken because it was a universal flood. Water's 15 cubits higher than the mountains, we made reference to that. You would have to be, even if you're in a basin and that filled up, you can't then go 15 cubits above the mountains because it would just disappear over the edge. And the waters prevailed for 150 days. And it took 230 days to dry up. So this wasn't a simple local affair. Normal floods don't last that long, don't take that long to dry up. And as we said, God doesn't break his word. He promised he would never again flood the earth. Now that word has been broken many times if it was just merely a local flood. And the evidence for the flood is universal. Wherever we go around the world is evidence of sedimentation, that the earth was covered with water and fossils within it. So I believe that everything points to the fact that it was a universal flood, exactly as God said.